You're watching Time and Tide, because watches aren't boring.
Gentlemen, welcome to Watch and Chill. This is the Audemars Piguet Beyond History Special Edition. It's a two-part edition. Today's episode is all about the past and how it resonates in the present. I had probably the best two people in the world to explore this topic. Michael Friedman, the head of complications at Audemars Piguet, and Eric Koo, collector and dealer extraordinaire. Thank you very much for being here, gentlemen. How are you both?
I'm doing well. What about you?
I'm great. I mean, look, Victoria is in lockdown at the moment, so I am unable to leave my house. But look, this is a good way to kill an afternoon, gentlemen. So, let's put time limits off and see where we go, because it's a great subject, the past, and certainly the vehicle that we're going to explore the past is very much a present obsession for you, Eric, and others, the Master01 Self-winding Chronograph. Michael, but before we get into that, how are you? What is your setting there? Is that your boudoir? It's quite beautiful. I see you, Eric.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a little early in the morning here in Liberasu, and by the way, quite chilly already this time of year, early in the morning. I should have had an additional jacket on. No, we're actually in the founder's house right now. This was, for those of you who had been to the original museum, the Audemars Piguet Museum, we're in one of the rooms that comprised that museum, which during the renovation and the creation of the spiral, we did a big renovation on the founder's house to bring back some of that 19th century charm as it originally had. Utilizing local woods, bringing in sort of a little bit of the bigger picture of the AP story. We even have a little Art Basel work from Sun Jun behind me, which I just noticed as well. To be honest with you guys, I haven't explored this room in detail since it's been decorated. So, as you know, this is all quite new. So I'm discovering this with you in real time.
Tell me, Michael, does it smell like rich mahogany? Because it looks like it would.
It's, the wood here, it's a lighter smell. It's a feathery smell. It's really beautiful. It's not so deep. It's lighter. It really is lovely. And if you've had a chance to come to Liberasu, or if you haven't, that's a big part of the experience here. It's a big part of Audemars Piguet culture, past, present, future, is this immersion in nature, this exploration of nature. So that's, again, why the new spiral is completely transparent, to put you right there in the middle of the Vallée des Joux, which is, of course, very much part of our identity and what we're all about.
Look, the thought of travel in the time of Corona is tantalizing like never before. But before we get too deeply into this subject and the museum, because I know that really, in a spiraling type of way, it wraps around our subject today. Eric reminded me, first off, we need a wrist check first, gentlemen. What are we wearing today? Because you've given it away, Eric.
Yes, I spoiled it.
You have it on? Oh, sweet. That's looking good. Yes. I have on one of our more recent openwork watches. This is the 26600 from the Code collection, the openwork tourbillon.
Beautiful. Now, look, before we get into it, I also did want to explain how we know each other, because, Michael, to me, you are the guy at SIHH that makes it interesting again, because the Salon de International Horlogerie, Australians cannot say that without butchering it, by the way. But this is a long series of presentations over a period of days. It's quite grueling, but then the Audemars Piguet presentation comes up and Mr. Michael Friedman steps up, and there is so much passion and so much energy behind the presentation, and there's so few cliches, I would say. After days and days and days of, DNA, what are the other big ones? The savoir-faire. This is all just pushed away, and the Michael show is one to really enjoy. And there's usually a special guest who runs in with some figures to discuss as well.
We try to make it fun. We don't entirely script those presentations. We leave open pockets, but most importantly, we always try to bring the attention back to the watchmakers, back to the men and women who create, who invent, who design these objects. As you know, we always have craftspeople there, not just demonstrating for the sake of it, but we explain in great detail what they're doing. And that's because we still do so much by hand. and we still are, that pursuit of hand finishing and those traditional techniques, regardless of futurism, regardless of even our most experimental watches, you always have that element, and they make my job easy, man. You know, we all, Jasmine Audemars once said, I heard her say, she said, essentially we all work for the watchmakers. We're here to represent their work in the best light possible, to shed light not just on Audemars Piguet, but on hand finishing and the history of watchmaking here in the Vallée des Joux. So when you start from that moment, and when I'm coming from the perspective of I have that responsibility to represent the bench, who I certainly am not talented enough. I did a brief apprenticeship. I learned a little, but you really come to understand what goes into it. Eric's smiling, he knows, he's taking a shot at it as well. That makes the job easy, whether it's at SIHH, whether it's with one collector, no matter what it is. When you empathize with the watchmakers, come to understand it, it makes the job really, really fun, really easy as well, in that sense.
And this is the beauty of this this booth, because it is, you know, there are maybe, I don't know how many booths in that area, but AP has audio chambers, it has artisans, it really has an immersive experience. But my favorite bit is just your presentation, where we're locked in that theater, and Michael goes wild every year. I love it. So that's how I know you. Now, Eric, we are only recently introduced. We're 2020 friends. Do you want to tell the fine viewers how we know each other? Because it's kind of quirky.
Yeah, I mean, look, as we all know, 2020 has been a very challenging year for everybody. It seems like one thing after the other. We got acquainted over the the terrible wildfires that were going on in Australia, and you guys were kind enough to kind of spearhead this campaign to have a charity auction that many brands participated in, and it was to raise obviously money for wildfire relief. It was quite successful. Although I don't represent a particular brand, I thought it would be nice to do something, like throw in some sort of a vintage watch and, have those proceeds go to this worthy cause. And, I think in the end, I don't remember the total, but I felt like the overall number achieved was quite substantial. And, hopefully it went to, to charity that really needed the funds,
Thanks to people like you, we raised nearly $250,000. So it was
Congratulations.
Quite a humbling experience to feel that the world had its eyes and hearts on Australia at that time. So that's how I know you, Eric. It's a really nice way to meet someone. I tell you, it's you already had a sterling reputation, and a lot of people in Australia are actually somewhat awestruck by Mr. Eric Koo. So to meet in that way, with you reaching out to me, I didn't even reach out to you. That was I just received this DM saying, hi, it's Eric. I want to give you a Tiffany stamp Rolex. I mean, who's going to say no to that at any time? But certainly for that cause. Great. So, gentlemen, let's get into today's subject, because people watching this are going to want to deep dive on the remaster. Look, the opening statement I want to make is, you did point out to me just now my Dylan behind me, but I'm all about remastering classics, and I'm all about the difference between reissuing a classic as it was and remastering it into something that gives you a fresh appreciation. Have I done a decent job at explaining the concept of remaster? Because that's how this watch looks to me. It looks like Immigration Song by Led Zeppelin sounds when it's been properly remastered. Tell me, am I anywhere near it?
You are. I mean, that's definitely the philosophical approach behind the project. Because, look, there are companies who can do a true historic reissue. Companies that had an industrial process historically can replicate an industrial watch today, and they can find those touch points in an easier way to really do an authentic recreation. And there's amazing ones out there on the market. As you know, at Audemars Piguet, all the watches were unique up until 1951. Everything was being crafted as an individual work. There were no set specifications for dials, cases, even movements. You'll see variation within the same calibers at times. So while we knew we wanted to honor and jump into the past in this way, we also knew there was no way we could do a true historic recreation. And also, as you know, Francois, quite well, there was also that desire to bring it up in a modern way, unapologetically, to embrace the watchmakers today. So absolutely, Andrew, you're on point, because we looked at broader culture, as Audemars Piguet always does, and we looked at music, we looked at film, we looked at the approach that artists themselves take revisiting their own work, and how many artists will embrace these new technologies to revisit their work in very real and meaningful ways. As you said, it's not just the upgrading to 4K or to expanded audio or expanded visual. It's going back to the source material and manipulating and working and enhancing that material. So if you're listening to a reissue, as you said, of Led Zeppelin 3 or of Quadrophenia by The Who, you can hear remixes of those albums and approaches that the artists themselves dove into to bring that content through a more contemporary lens, and so people can appreciate it with the technologies that we have today. So that was the inspiration, the philosophical, say, current behind Remaster. We knew even if we wanted to, we couldn't do a historic reissue in significant numbers, a pure historic reissue in that purest sense. So what was the next best thing? Taking the design elements and the design attributes, but also bringing in the modernity of how watch movements are created today.
And look, those are the elements that make it so compelling in an era where there is this almost slavish, well, you know, to your point, there aren't many true reissues because there are certain criteria that are very hard to meet to make it true. But there's definitely a lot about this watch that excited me. And if we look at our other guest in this conversation, I suppose you could look at this simply and say, hang on, there's the creator, there's the broker, that would be me, or the fan, that would be me, and then there's the buyer. But that's not the only reason Eric's here, is it? Eric, how do you come into the Remaster story, aside from being the end consumer, as they say?
I mean, as you have known, I'm really enthusiastic about vintage things, vintage watches. Michael and I have been friends for a while, and we've been talking about, all sorts of different horological pursuits, topics, and whatnot. And, I've always had like a really fond appreciation of vintage AP watches. As Michael had said, up until 1951, I think everything was really like unique. And then, there were some things that were kind of done in series after that. But again, there was a really bespoke kind of component and feeling about like every watch, things that were done that time, like he said, could not be kind of like serially replicated right now. It's just like an inefficient way of doing it. And you couldn't sell like a completely handmade AP manual wind chrono now. The labor involved in doing that, the price would be astronomical for it to even have any bit of a potentiality as becoming a product, And so a lot through the course of a lot of our discussions, I had bought various watches. One of them, which was actually a vintage AP chronograph. It was found at a watch show in the United States here. And, these are very rare watches, like AP chronos. There's a couple hundred of them, a few hundred made ever. And finding one is almost like finding a unicorn, So in this particular instance, I found one. It was made in yellow gold. The watch was in decent condition. The movement had a bit of a patina on it over age, and the dial was just completely refinished, knowing the prowess of the workshop and the facilities that they have at AP, I automatically called Michael, and then we started a dialogue about, hey, this is a restoration project that needs to be done. I'm okay with spending the money that it costs. I don't need it back tomorrow, the day after, or in a month, and let's just see like what can be done, And one of the favorite things for me about the brand is that they're very open and very eager to share information with collectors. This is something that is kind of a rare attribute, I think. A lot of brands, might have archives like AP does, but for one reason or another, they're kind of in a safe. They don't really want to share all the information, and it's difficult to find out more information. This is not how things are done at AP. They were very transparent with information. with the serial number of the watch, the movement, they were able to identify the ledger, find out what the dial configuration was, when it left the factory, blah, 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 so on and so forth, And so we sought over time to basically restore this watch to its former glory, make it as close as possible. And I know, one of the things is both Michael and I are really detail-oriented people. And, we could obsess over like the comma in Audemars Piguet, like on the old dials. So, through many trials and tribulations and, to the skillful work of the people at the workshop, eventually there was like a dial design made that we basically thought was like perfect. Like, wow, this is like a really great thing. And, at that time, then Michael kind of whispered in my ear, hey, we're doing some kind of project. This might have some kind of a role in this thing. It's interesting. Stay tuned, And obviously we know now that project eventually became the watch that's on my wrist right now, which I'm really happy about.
Yeah, it's so fun to hear your perspective, like how it went through your lenses, because of course I'm aware of that, but on the company side, it's very exciting when a known collector and friend, somebody who is already very familiar with us, comes in with a pressure-free scenario. No deadline on time, no deadline, no restrictions on budget. It's, hey guys, take your time, dive deep, study the dial. And I remember, Eric, you said, I don't care if it takes 6 months or 2 years, let's work to get the best restored dial possible. That is everything a family business like ours wants to hear, because it's outside the scope of, let's say, sort of a daily grind where you're really working towards deadlines and this type of thing. And Audemars Piguet is at its best when we can take our time and when we can let things stretch to really dive deep. And Eric touched upon a couple things that makes it a reality here. And again, it's tied to being a family business and independent. The investment isn't just in the museum and the museography and the architecture, it's in the people. There are a team of scholars in the heritage team here at Audemars Piguet, multiple curators, a dedicated archivist. We even have somebody still handwriting every single Audemars Piguet watch created in the archives. So if Eric's remaster on his wrist, this code tourbillon on my wrist, yes, it's in the computer system, but it's also still manually entered into the archives. We're continuing this history. What's that?
Why would you bother to do that? Like that's quaint, but what's the point?
It's honor and respect. It really is. It's Jules and Edward set up this company with Jules Audemars and Edward Piguet, set this business up with a very, very clear vision in mind. And it's on each generation's responsibility to respect what those goals were, focusing on complications, hand finishing, independence, keeping things centered here in Le Brassus. But it's also upon us to be adding each generation to continuing that story, to continue to expand that story. Hence why we arrive at things like the Super Sonore and RD2, another one of a watch that Eric has appreciation for, we could talk about later. So it's this dual pursuit of really of while we are pushing to the future, pushing to the next generation of complications and calibers, it's also really staying rooted in a very real and very genuine sense. And it's not just in words at all. In fact, when I arrived at the company 7 years ago, initially as the historian, I was kind of surprised. There was so much more going on here that I even knew. And to Eric's point earlier about sharing of the archives, I think a lot of brands would love to. But to do it successfully needs a lot of investment in time and energy. So we had multiple people pouring through these archives and interpreting. First generation documents need to be interpreted. They need to be studied. They need to be assessed. All of this study is folded into the complications book, where, to Eric's point earlier, we came to confirm we only produced 307 chronographs in the vintage era, 208 moon phase watches, and 35 minute repeaters, 550 vintage complications. That was something we all knew in the collecting community, before I was with AP, we all knew that AP complications were rare, but the question was, how rare are they? And then other questions came to surface as well. How exactly were those Valjoux calibers developed? Because the vintage chronograph that Eric is speaking of, the 13-line Valjoux, is the same movement blank that was utilized, for example, in the Patek Philippe 1518. And that then arrives at another important academic point where scholars and collectors like Eric become critical to the conversation, the difference between an ebosh and a movement blank. A lot of people don't realize that, yes, Audemars Piguet, Patek Philippe, Vacheron relied on other brands historically to produce not movements, but movement blanks, the chassis of the watch. This was the importance of Valjoux, of Lecoultre, of Lemania, these other brands providing that sort of institutional structure to create the base plates by which then all of the complications in hand finishing can go. That's why whether you're looking at a 13 line from the 40s or even take the caliber that's in the 5402, Audemars Piguet called it the 2120, Vacheron called it the 1120. It was the very first models had the same movement. So those did indeed derive from a JLC movement blank. But I've seen those in kit form, and they take a very different life depending on how they're finished and who's ultimately producing them. Now that movement's produced exclusively here at Audemars Piguet. But so these types of things that are known out there in the market, to be able to dive deeper and start sussing them out becomes interesting. So then here comes Eric with this chronograph project, giving us this opportunity to dive deep and challenging us directly. He wants to see a dial restoration where at a quick glance, he'll be tricked. His brain will process it as a vintage dial. And this allowed us to really study down to chemical analysis of color. I mean, we went deep. We tried so many different things, so many different techniques. We really were able to stretch and push this project. We were lucky. At the time in the restoration workshop, we had a gentleman named Angelo Manzoni, who was an incredible watchmaker, as detail-oriented as Eric and I on dial details. The brands historically were always incredible at movement restoration, but dials were something that the brands until the last 10 years weren't quite there. So if you look at restoration for major brands 20 years ago, 25 years ago, some of the dial restorations don't take the purity approach that collectors and scholars look for. That's a big conscious shift that Audemars Piguet has taken in the last decade. Angelo was one of the watchmakers in the restoration workshop, along with Francisco, that really were pursuing this. He since has tragically passed away, unexpectedly passed away. So this was one of the last big projects that he was really proud of and super happy to work with Eric on. So while we're working on Eric's watch, simultaneously Remaster is up and running, or at least it's getting going. So then you have myself and Angelo and Sebastian Vivas, the museum director of Audemars Piguet. We're in a room together and we're looking at renderings of the Remaster dial, while we're also working on Eric's restoration of his chronograph. It became logical. The next step was, well, hey, let's get the opinion, let's get some thoughts of where this project is going from somebody who we trust and know, and let's get a little bit of feedback. Are we heading in the right direction with this type of project? And that's where the conversations began. The three of us felt that it was important to get that collector feedback to make sure we're going in that right direction. And there were some key points. Remaster was not a safe choice in terms of design. We could have taken a much safer stainless steel chronograph with a enamel dial with red and blue scale, something much more direct. We wanted to take something that represents the unconventionality of Audemars Piguet, the different approach, combination of materials, interesting finishings, and most importantly, dial details. We arrived at that watch for a very specific reason. And yes, the case was a big part of it, the two-tone, but it was the dial of the original 1943 that we wanted to challenge ourselves to recreate in a contemporary way. So that's where the two projects overlapped, where Eric's restoration project and Remaster eclipse. And then we realized, hey, let's get some feedback. Let's see what's happening here. And it's kind of like, again, back to the music metaphor with Dylan behind you. You're working on an album. You're far from it being done, and you want a buddy of yours to hear the demo. Hey, are we heading in the right direction? Do you like how this is sounding? And thankfully Eric was there to.
What do you think of the demo, Eric?
When I heard the first demo, there was a smile on my face. I mean, what can I say, you know? Getting back to, like, it's just all about the details, right? I mean, you know, Michael touched on this. Normally, the dial is almost like a secondary consideration when there's a restoration done. And for people that are like the diehard enthusiasts of like vintage watches, I mean, you know, in terms of like the dollars and cents of collecting, right? A refinished dial on a very important watch is catastrophic to the value. You could lose 90% of the value when the dial is not right, okay? You can never recreate an original dial, but if you make something that is, I don't want to, it's not like trickery per se, but it's like that you look at it and it's got all those qualities and attributes of the original, like that more than makes up for the fact that you can't get that original dial anymore, you know? I mean, one thing about this process, which I don't remember off the top of my head right now, I think it was maybe like a year and a half it took for everything, or maybe a little bit longer, I'm not sure. But, you know, this is not like a brand that, you know, makes money, obviously, selling like new watches. Like restoring and pouring hundreds of hours into something like this really is like a labor of love, you know, and it's a sign of respect to the history of the brand. It's a sign of like respect to the collectors. And, you know, it's something that not every brand is willing to take that approach, and, you know, not every brand will.
Can we please, gentlemen, please, can we close the loop on that watch that you sent back? We haven't talked about it since. We diverted to the thing it inspired, but tell me about...
It's actually right here too. I mean, I'll send nice photos that can be shared. There's an engraving on the back that says June 1947. And it's just, you know, it's a really special watch for me. And it's special for many reasons, because this kind of resulted from and kind of like enhanced you know, Michael and I's like friendship. It made me really feel special about the brand. And, you know, also our friend who's no longer with us, like Angelo, worked so hard on this. And it was really like a culmination of like so many things, you know?
And it was, and Eric's post about it, when upon completion, you wrote a beautiful note on Instagram that ricocheted through the company in a very interesting way, because it was pure acknowledgement of the skill set of the restoration workshop, but very passionate as well. And this is at the heart of these types of projects, whether remaster or whether a vintage restoration, and it touches upon that notion of movement and dial. Is movement tends to be a much more intellectual brain kind of exercise and reaction when we analyze movements, when we look at finishing, when even the approach to restoration, where the dial of the watch is pure art. It is, of course, created through scientific and through very technical means, but our reaction to it tends to be from the heart more so from the head initially. The first reaction on a watch, it's that first impression. I've always said that the dial is the painting in many ways, and that's that power that Eric said before on a vintage watch, where the value could be 90% tied up into the dial, because it's a very simple reason. A movement that's been water damaged or oxidized could be restored back to its original beauty, and no one will question if you're utilizing all the original components, everything is done by hand, and you're doing it in the right historically sensitive way. You're actually going to be celebrated for that work. With dial, it's a totally different story, because you don't, as Eric said, you don't have that option. You can't do it. The movements have and this isn't, by the way, just for watches. This goes back hundreds of years. If we look at Renaissance clocks, even something which were Renaissance clocks had been collected for in later eras as well. So if you were in the 19th century collecting Renaissance clocks, which there were many people who were doing this, it was very normal to have a movement restored, but the collectors even then would want to see the original silvering on the dials. They would want to see the oxidation on the watch. So this, on the clock, excuse me. So this isn't even just new to our field. This connects to other collecting fields as well. Furniture is another one. You could restore the interior aspects of a furniture. You can replace the dovetailing, for example, of the drawers. But if you go ahead and refinish and repaint the furniture, it's game over. Painting as well. You can restore the back of the canvas. You can secure it, but you repaint it in a poor way, everything changes. So this dynamic isn't unique to watches. I think it's been more recently explored in the field of vintage watches. Also, vintage wristwatches are babies. I mean, we're talking about a field that's not much more than 100 years old in terms of actual production numbers. This is still a very young business in many respects, which is fortunate for us because these projects and these conversations lead to new discoveries and new approaches moving forward.
Now, that's all very true. And Eric, I think when you held the watch up briefly before, this is a visual medium. So just imagine now there's going to be some scrolling shots of that watch. Can you just go hard on the details for me? Describe to me this watch, let's get pornographic here for people that are listening or watching.
As I unzip, no. No. So yellow gold chronograph.
Saxophone as a music track here, Eric.
It's a yellow gold chronograph, I think around 33 millimeter size case, which was the norm. We think it's small, but it was kind of the norm at the time. It's got a Arabic 12, and then the indexes are sticks. A thing that AP was like really into, you'll notice on a lot of these, and including the remaster, there's like a red 45 on like the minutes counter. This is what's known as like a soccer timer, because correct me here, Michael, there was somebody in the line of command, one of the proprietors of the company at some point was a big soccer enthusiast and insisted on the 45 being there to time like the halftime of soccer matches.
Exactly. Right? That's right, Jacques-Louis Audemars. That's correct. So it was the family member. It was the Audemars family themselves. And Jacques-Louis was a huge soccer fan. He wanted all those chronographs to see that 45-minute indication, so he could time his halftime. And the vast majority of those 307 vintage chronographs produced after that moment he made that decision have that soccer timer. The end of the production, we start to see it disappear again. But many of those watches in the very late 30s through the mid 40s include that 45 timer.
It's not 45. It's also the fact that there's a pop of red as well. So welcome. You wonder if there wasn't a 45, would there be red on the dial?
Exactly. So that's like a kind of an attribute about this. One thing that I always find that you'll notice, like the minutes counter and the seconds counter, like AP uses this very particular font, and it's something like look, in the old days, a lot of these dials were manufactured by dial companies. It was like a third-party vendor, if you will. They very well could have made dials for other brands. So there were certain attributes that were shared on them, but there's a lot of like distinctly unique things to like this AP dial. And the other thing is you'll notice like with this and other brands like Patek Philippe, is that there's what they call like the long signature on the dial and then like a short signature. So the long signature, it says Audemars Piguet and Co. Geneva underneath. And this really wonderful kind of like older, like early 20th century font, which again is something that, with a remaster, you see a lot of these same details, and in fact, like tying this back to the remaster, I got this watch during this shelter in place lockdown, whatever you want to call it. And, it was like a really nice diversion, if you will. I think it was the first and, maybe kind of like only watch that I got in the depths of this thing going on. And, at that time, you're spending a lot of time at home reflecting on all sorts of things and, just thinking more than you normally do. And I remember opening the box, looking at it, taking a loop out, looping the dial. And the details of the dial are just so like perfect in my eyes. Like really, everything from like the vertical like satin striping on the dial that's subtle underneath the lacquer, the treatment that's done to the typography on the dial. Like everything is just like really, really done like perfectly.
I'll just jump in and say that, well, I joked about this being pornographic, but the people that would find this most titillating and salacious would be the watchmakers that did all those details, because how often does someone drink them in and relish them like you are right now?
Yeah.
You know what I mean, Michael? Like, as a watchmaker, hearing Eric luxuriate in every nuance, it must just be so gratifying, because even to the naked eye, like a lot of people, they're going to pass over these things.
We take this feedback and we bring it directly back to the men and women that worked on the watches. This is what we do. Just yesterday, I was in Lalac working with the team on some future movements, and part of that discussion was giving them feedback on our most recent releases, not just on the subjective feedback of clients, but also the performance of watches, the perception of watches, as well as reactions. So absolutely, this is what it's all about. This is the sharing of passion and then the transmission of that passion. We talk a lot about, as you said earlier, savoir-faire in this business and techniques in this business, but really the key element is that passion, shared love we have for these details and for these elements. And what's incredible is what used to be a very small selection of, let's say, watch nerds or watch insiders, it's yet another example of revenge of the nerds in broader culture. Like, it's hard when I'm asked internally, like sometimes we'll be doing a brand campaign or something and they'll say, well, is this for watch geeks or is this for general public? And I look at them and I say, guys, there's no difference anymore, because the watch geeks are the ones writing the mainstream articles now. Like, there is no, revenge of the nerds is upon us in the watch world. We are now out and we're vocal and we're sharing this knowledge, and you see it resonating in broader culture. You see people on the peripheral of watch collecting having discussions about two-tone dials, signatures, retailer signatures, finishing. So that's incredible. The fact that what used to be a very small group is now becoming a much broader discussion, again, because it brings the attention back onto the process, back onto the people, and not just the hand finishing, also the advanced technologies, which are a big part of this business. The programmers and the technicians and the engineers are also part of this fabric of watchmaking today. So projects like this and passionate discussions like this allow us to really explore what this business is all about and how things are created and made. But back to your question, absolutely. I mean, we wanted that dial to make people melt. I mean, that was the idea. And I even internally, I said something like, look, take all of the energy we would put into the hand finishing of a Royal Oak bracelet and apply that. Let's take that same ethos to this dial. That resonated with the people working on the project. They got what we were saying, was leave no stone unturned. Now, one thing that Eric and I haven't mentioned that was one of his first feedback, and his feedback helped with the momentum, was, as you can imagine, the very first renderings of the watch still included the date aperture, because it was utilizing the modern caliber 4401 that we developed for the code chronograph, which is a beautifully finished movement, very, very shock resistant, beautifully finished, incredible functional movement, flyback chronograph. But of course, Eric, I'll let you pick up on what your reaction was upon seeing the date aperture, and please pick it up from here, man.
Yeah, I mean, like, getting back, like, in a little bit of like a macro sense or whatever, it's like I obsess about fonts. And like it's something that, like, subconsciously, like, I'm sure not most, but many of us do. It's like your eye catches it and then your brain takes a second to process, like, why is this wrong to me? And it's something as simple as, I don't know exactly when Michael and I think have some mutual friends who are even more geeky about fonts. But, there was some time where the serif font, like, they invented like a sans serif font, okay? And then that is like a shortcut somehow. And somehow, like, my eyes don't process that like the same way. And so there are some brands out there. Like, so now if I close my eyes and I think of like the logo or the word mark for like Audemars Piguet, right? Immediately I see like the tips of the serifs on like the A, the P, like all these little details, okay? On some brands that for whatever reason, they're just like, you know what, we're going to come up with maybe a proprietary, but you know, like the sans serif font, you know, and then they try to tie it in with something like historical. Like to me, part of that is like you're phoning it in, you know, like you're not, there's something like not right about it that doesn't sit well, like on some level, you know. And then I think tying in with the chrono story that Michael was talking about, the early renderings, it's something I remember like to do with like the date aperture. You know, the font is kind of like not really aligned with the fonts on the rest of the dial or whatever. And it was just like a little bit weird, you know?
And get rid of it. Move
Exactly.
move it on. So indeed, we were already exploring the possibility, but when we realized that for remaster to work, we needed to adapt the caliber to not conceal the date, which would be a shortcut version, but to actually remove the entire date system from the movement, which is what was ultimately done. So essentially a new caliber was created through an adaptation of the 4401, so we could have that new generation flyback chronograph self-winding, but without the date feature, to make sure the design aesthetics were as pure as possible on that dial. There are date aperture, yes or no. There are people for it, people against it. However, when it comes to a historic approach, even though this was a remaster, the design could not permit a date, and it was clear. And the conversations with Eric internally, it became apparent for everyone that we had to take that extra step to do that. And that's not, you know, inside a manufacturer who are producing 40,000 watches, it's not a normal conversation to have. You know, most general consumers are happy to see a date aperture. So it's a little counterintuitive to come back and say, get rid of that complication. We want it to be simpler. Internally, when you're looking at those larger quantities, and when you have a brand where you have a reach globally and an enthusiast globally and many new collectors coming into the picture, it was a bit counterintuitive to some at first. But then you show the original, you show the remaster, and you see a version without the date, and then of course that's really when we knew we were getting closer and closer and closer. And then the other aspect which we came back on was that regardless of the edition, whether it was going to be 100 pieces, 250, ultimately we decided at 500, the essential element was the cases have to be entirely hand finished. And that's something that's been somewhat missed from some of the conversation about remaster. And you know, this is 500 pieces entirely mirror finished, combining steel and pink gold. That's a remaster unto itself, to have 500 pieces entirely hand finished, those cases. And Eric, you've got it in hand. I think they did a good job with achieving that same sort of vintage feel aesthetic. And for anyone who does casework who might be watching, you can attest that entirely mirror finishing a two-tone watch and having it be even and clean and consistent over that many units requires its own approach and its own skill set. That was yet another way we were able to bring the watchmakers of today into the process in a very, very meaningful way. And that's really what the project was about. It's that passing that baton actively, past, present, and future. Again, hence why Eric's input was also important, because one thing we haven't spoken about yet is, as much as Eric is an enthusiast of vintage watches and old watches, he also has a great appreciation, I'll let you speak more about it, on contemporary watchmaking as well. And that was, for me, why it was important to get Eric's feedback, because this was a watch that unapologetically embraces both spaces. It's simultaneously a vintage-inspired watch, but it's a very contemporary watch as well. And that's why, in particular, I wanted that feedback. We wanted that feedback and that sort of insight from the collector, how he will react to it and how others may react to it. Are we going to hit those notes the right way? And if, by the way, it wouldn't have worked if the dial did not have that level of detail, if we had missed some of those elements, if we had done a modern signature instead of a vintage, if we had chosen a safer dial, if those cases weren't hand finished in that way, it would have missed the mark. It required each and every one of those steps to be able to have an impact for the people that are looking for this type of object.
I want to get back to Dylan just very quickly, Eric, and hold that thought, because I think the most rock and roll thing about the Master01 Self-winding chronograph is in the name, which is that, you know, we talk about the removal of a date complication. That's not as rock and roll as taking a manual wound chronograph and making it self-winding. So, Eric, how did you feel about that? If you felt great injury and offense at the inclusion of a date window, how did you feel about the self-winding part?
So, you know, again, like reflecting on the name of the watch, like the remaster, right? It's basically evolutionary rather than revolutionary interpretation of something. I'm not sure that all of the viewers here realize, but there is an actual watch that this watch was based on, and it was something that was recently at auction. It was acquired by the museum, and you know, visually, I think it's a very, very close interpretation of the original. Some dimensions are kind of like beefed up to more modern standards, and you know, like reading some of the commentary online after the release of the watch. You know, there were questions about, oh, you know, manual wind versus automatic chronograph, good, bad. What, you know, what's everybody's opinion? And, you know, it was split. I think there was no consensus as to what was better or whatever. But to me, the logical conclusion here, the logical decision had to have been an automatic chrono. You know, I mean, I happen to wear a few manual wind watches because they're like vintage watches or whatever, but you know, for practicality's sake, like a chronograph that you're going to wear should have an automatic movement. And then also, like, what better way to, again, kind of expand on the ethos of this idea of a remaster is to put like the most cutting edge, like the newest automatic caliber that AP has made into this watch that is inspired by the past, you know?
This is it. I mean, look, in all of our businesses and all of our fields, whether it's watchmaking or your own independent fields, it's on each generation to leave your mark and to represent your era, to contribute, to be part of that cultural dialogue, but also to make sure that things are moving forward. And it really, for us in our lens as a company, would have really been, this was the movements that we're working on. Self-winding movements are of the era. Flyback chronograph is something that new generation caliber chronographs, many collectors expect. So we really felt this was the way to tie it the best way possible, the most pure way possible, and to bring the most recent and active pursuits at Audemars Piguet into this picture. And it was conscious. And it's, you know, I understand the passion and love for a traditional manual wound chronograph. I think they're incredible. I get it. I 100% get it. But, you know, if I'm driving back down the mountain from Le Brosseau back to my home outside of Nyon, as much as I love a vintage car, I don't want to do that in the snow. I don't want to drive a 1943 car. What I'm getting at is that notion of holding up to the turbulence of everyday life. The vintage chronograph on Eric's wrist now, or the one not on his wrist, the one on his desk from 1943, that's not a watch that he can take out into the rain. It's not a watch that he's going to go on a jog with his wife. That's not a piece he's going to go out to the restaurant with and be casually wearing it. He's going to be conscious that he has a fragile historic object on his wrist. So already you're in a contemporary space. You know you need to have water resistancy. So you already are significantly away from vintage watches right there in terms of gaskets, in terms of securing the movement. You know you have to have shock resistancy. That's just the standards. You're already there. So it's this idea that if we did a manual wound movement, it somehow would have been more pure. I understand the sentiment, but to really look how watches are fabricated today and to pass quality control, most importantly, to hold up to the way that people are wearing, enjoying them, that was the logical. We had to go there. We had to also show what we're up to now, represent what we're up to now. And that, to me, is what made the project much bigger than just a museum story or a heritage story. And that's so key at AP is the museum and the heritage department aren't siloed from the company. They are very, very much the heart of it. It is not uncommon to see Giulio Papi and Luca Raggi, let's say the two big inventors at Audemars Piguet, with their teams. It's not uncommon to see them consulting with Francisco Pasandan, who's been running the restoration workshop for decades. And when I say consulting, I don't mean, hey, take a look at this. I mean, hey, can you help us solve this problem? What's your perception of this? What do you think of the finishing of this? The dialogue between the teams, and Eric's witnessed this himself, it's so active and so alive. And it's very much part of what we do day to day. It's essential for us. Again, we have that weight on our shoulders. This company is in the hands of the founding families, and it's going to remain so. So if something changes on our watch, it's game over. We have to keep pursuing that line and advancing it and pushing it. And projects like this were a new way to approach that, and a very fun way to approach it.
Can I get physical again, gentlemen? Because there's one person in this Zoom chat who has the ability to hold up both watches in each hand and talk about exactly what you're discussing, which is how does the Master01 Self-winding Chronograph feel on the wrist, and what are the differences with that vintage piece, and how do you interact with it in the way that Michael hoped you would? In that, do you feel that this is a resolutely modern and capable and robust piece of technology, as well as something that evokes a time in history?
I mean, it's really interesting because the design, like the way that the lugs look and everything, this is decidedly like a vintage design, but the proportions have been like updated. The case is significantly larger, to kind of like a more modern type of size, if you will. But, it's just, I wear it all the time. I've worn it quite often since then. The aesthetics, my eyes gravitate towards like all the vintage points of it, but it is a modern watch.
Let's go there again, just because like when you talk about watches, it's actually quite exciting for the listener. So maybe let's do the same thing you did with the vintage model with the remaster. What are the things that, having worn this watch, because like you are a great channel for us to someone who's had the watch on their wrist as a watch enthusiast, which is what a lot of our viewers are going to be. They're going to be you in terms of the way that they might appreciate these nuances.
So the funny thing is another thing I have on my desk here with me is the AP Complicated Watchbook, which is a masterpiece on its own. And, it's funny, when you're looking through this, they document so many of these different vintage chronographs, calendar watches, minute repeaters, and whatever, right? And you see certain design cues that are characteristically AP. I'm looking at the remaster now in front of me. And then like that really like tall elongated 12 o'clock, like the font they use for that is something that, they used in many of the chronographs that they made. And there's a lot of things about it. The color of the dial, the gold of the dial, the 45 in red, the fonts that they use for the minutes and the seconds, these are all like very characteristic AP elements that to any kind of like collector that knows about vintage watches, they see that immediately their brain connects it to AP. It's just, I mean, nobody in my eyes, like, look, there's plenty of like really great chronographs on the market, watches on the market, watches inspired by vintage designs of their respective brands, but something like this is really like uniquely AP. I mean, there's nothing else on the market that holds like a similar space in my eyes.
What about tactility, again, to get physical and to give people a sense of how this watch feels? Is it significantly heavier? Is it more substantial than, because it's a lot bigger than the 33 mil with the extra 7 millimeters of dial?
Well, just to jump in, the watch it's based on was actually 36, a little over 36. So we upsized from 36 to 40, just to be clear. So proportionately, it was a little easier exercise than moving from a 33 up to a 40. Just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, I mean, what makes the original watch unique was the fact that it was kind of oversized. This is not like it wasn't like a normal thing. A 36 millimeter chronograph at the time was like huge. It's like a 40 millimeter now. But there's something like really interesting because it has that decidedly vintage case with the kind of like lug design, the really tall bezel. Everything is like really polished, and you know, it's different, but it feels like a modern watch on the wrist. It's not heavy. There's a certain like heft to it, but it's not heavy. The thickness is like pretty contemporary. And, you know, like Michael was alluding to, with these vintage watches, they're just like a little more fragile feeling. Even gold ones, like, because they're small, they feel kind of light, you know? I have in front of me actually like another vintage AP chrono, the other vintage AP that I have. And, you know, it's also like a smaller size, like a 33 millimeter, 32.5 millimeter case. But yeah, they feel different. I mean, the new watch, it's weird looking at this case design and thinking it's from like the 1940s, but, you know, totally robust. You can wear it like, you know, I don't know exactly how waterproof it is, but I imagine I can wash my hands and not have to worry about the crystal fogging up, you know?
No problem.
So it's just like it's a very usable design and a very functional watch for kind of modern life, you know, like Michael was saying earlier.
And look, lastly, to round off this episode, which has been so enriching, I think, for anyone that's interested in understanding the concept, right through to someone that's interested in buying this amazing piece, it's been really deep. But we could have gone deeper, and I'm somewhat. I think we could probably uncork a bottle of scotch and be here for hours on this subject. But I do want to finish on it because the museum is a development that times in with this piece. In the same year. So it is all part of a story, and without necessarily going too far down the rabbit hole, sure. I think painting a picture of the facility and if we were to look at it from above, how does this speak to what we've discussed today? Because I have a feeling that it's all connected.
Very much. Look, I mean, we start from the premise with high-end watchmaking that these types of objects, these are objects of permanence in an era of obsolescence. So right away, watchmaking at this level is a sector that is so unique within broader culture. We're consciously creating things to outlive us. That's weird to think about through the lens of 2020, where everything is about upgrade culture and replacement. And as a result, this is part of the reason why this field is resonating with so many other disciplines and fields. A lot of the people in the technology world have become very interested in watchmaking in the last several years because their reality is based on the complete opposite premise. They already know their phase in and phase out, and they're already looking at upgrade. And here you have these objects that are consciously being made to live forever, essentially. And let's not forget the world's greatest museums in the world, throughout the entire world, whether you're looking at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the British Museum, the Rijksmuseum, the Hermitage, you name it, objects of time measurement are there along the greatest works of art. So I stress this point. I started as a museum curator. It's my background, but I state this because objects of time measurement are so central to culture, because time is so central to culture. That's something that Audemars Piguet thinks and reacts to often, is that we think about the people involved in those creations and the longevity of these objects, because again, it's a family business, and we're looking at that own longevity. We're coming up on 150 years soon, and we're looking at where things are going to be continuing from that point on. So to go back to your question, yes, the museum, here we are in this founder's home, which was the original museum, which was also where Jules and Edward worked out of. Jules Audemars and Edward Piguet, where they worked out of, the workshop right up above me a couple floors, is where Eric's watch was restored. The restoration workshop today is the original workshop of Jules and Edward, looking out the same windows, looking at the same views of the valley. The difference is now when you look out at that valley, when you look down from the founder's house, you see the incredible spiral designed by Bjarke Ingels from Big Group, who we teamed up with many, many, many years ago, long before Big really exploded. We were lucky to team up with him. And consequently, architecture is another field very concerned with permanence in this era of obsolescence, right? Architecture, a great work of architecture, is consciously created to cut through the timeline and to continue to be loved and relevant and enjoyed. the architecture and the content are one and the same. Bjarke Ingels' designs are created to be explored and investigated, and you're meant to have a great time, but you're also having an intellectual moment there. There's also pathway of discovery. So we wanted the macro and the micro to very much be in coordination and communication. That was the key point. Two, of course, the spiral itself is very much resembles sort of the key element, the heartbeat of the watch, if you may, the balance, everything that's happening there around the escapement. It has that sense to it. But as I mentioned before, it's all glass. You see through and then you see out. And for Sebastian Vivas and myself, who had primarily curated the exhibitions together, that's a big challenge through a curatorial lens. Most museums, you're blocking light and controlling light. We started from the premise that you're going to be bathed in light. So that also created some fun challenges how we're going to approach the exhibitions. But what you're going to discover at the Audemars Piguet Museum when we are able to travel again, when things are restricted, when the restrictions come down, and when we're over this moment, when you come through it, what you're going to see is really a journey. This isn't throwing hundreds and hundreds of watches at you to discover one at a time. There's cultural context, historical context, and thematic context. So you really start to get a feel and a picture for how, not just how the watches were made, not just the exceptional pieces, but the context in which they were created. What I mean is there's a section of the museum where you go through the decades, but you just don't see the watches. You see images of architecture, fashion, transportation, and technology. 4 clusters from 4 10 to 15 year periods embracing those broader moments. And what we wanted to achieve, and what Audemars Piguet always wants to achieve, can we simultaneously communicate to the Eric Kous, to the big collectors, to the people deep into this field, into this business as collectors, as passionate, but also simultaneously communicate to people who are brand new to watchmaking, who are very young, kids even. It's no secret how much we do presentations at universities, at student groups, mentorship programs. All of this is so important to the company. It's so central to it. So the museum is a great expression of all of this. The objects within are really the pathway to the people. And this is why in the new museum, the Grand Complication Workshop is inside the new Audemars Piguet Museum. Not a simulation, but the 6 watchmakers creating our 8 to 10 Grand Comps a year. For everyone at AP, the Grand Comp is as defined from Jules and Edward: minute repeater, split second, perpetual calendar, all together. That's our Grand Complication. These watches being made for 21, 22, and 23 are literally a matter of a couple meters from the historic Grand Complication watches. So it's not just in words, it's in practice. We're lucky as a family business. We have so much first generation documentation. We don't tell stories, we share histories. And it's a different place to begin. It's nothing you'll hear me say. We started talking about the press presentations, you remember I would always state very clearly, what I'm showing you is all based on first generation documentation. So even in a pure brand marketing context like SIHH presentations of yesteryear, even then we're only showing you the first generation documents. So when we talk about Audemars Piguet setting up the global distribution network at the 1889 Paris Expo, we have the certificate that passed through the families. Everything has that. So that's what we wanted to showcase, that continuity, and that the continuity is a result not of the products, but of the people. And then the other key element, the red line, which connects all Audemars Piguet watches, is play of light. Finishing techniques on all cases to create a play of light. The Royal Oak is known for this, but the Royal Oak is an expression of finishing techniques that had long occurred. In the Complications book that Eric showed, you're going to pour through it and you'll see satin and mirror polishing together on angles going back 70 years before the Royal Oak came about. Gento was, of course, very conscious of all of this techniques. He had designed many watches for AP prior. So showcasing that play of light, that hand finishing, and the museum itself is that play of light. You're immersed inside that nature and that relationship between time and nature.
Eric, what are you looking forward to about the museum when we get there?
Well, I had this grandiose vision of walking through the doors and being presented in a box my remaster. That didn't happen exactly that way.
It was supposed to happen. It was supposed to happen.
Exactly. But, 2020 is about adapting and rolling with the punches. So, I'll be over there soon enough. And, I'm just like looking forward to seeing everything that Michael was just talking about.
Gentlemen, thank you. It's been a relatively restrained but still thorough deep dive today. I really appreciate both of your time, and I hope everyone who watched this enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew and Eric. Great to see you guys.